You said fox in the hen house.
Yes.
Something that the board and the chairman were worried about. Why would they call you a fox? So you keep saying activist investing is there's nothing to worry about. It's always good.
Sure.
Mostly good. But, that expression applied in this context, they were still worried about that.
Sure.
And so, there's a million questions here. But first of all, what does the process of getting on the board look like?
So a board can always admit a member at any time in their discretion for a U.S. company. That maybe there's some jurisdiction where you need a shareholder vote, but in most cases, a board can vote on any director that they want. If the board doesn't invite you to the party, you have to apply to be a member, in effect. And that process is called, basically it's the process of ultimately running a slate for a meeting where you propose a number. Any shareholder can propose to be on a board of a company if they own 1 share of stock in the business. And getting your name in the company's, the materials they sent to shareholders, those rules were written in a way that were very unfavorable and very difficult to get in the door. And those rules have been changed very recently, where the company now has to include a candidate, really all the candidates in the materials they sent to shareholders, so the shareholders pick the best ones. When we ran proxy contests in the past, that was not the case. And so you have to spend a lot of money, mostly mailing fees and all kinds of other legal and other expenses to let everyone know you're running, like running a political campaign. And then you got to run around and meet with the big shareholders, fly around the country, explain your case to them. And then there's a shareholder meeting. And if you get a majority of the votes, you get on.
What's this proxy contest / battle idea? What's
the battle comes when they don't want you to get on.
Okay.
And a lot of that has to do with, I would say, pride, normal human kind of stuff. A lot of times a board of an underperforming company doesn't want to admit that they've underperformed. And boards of directors 20 years ago, when we started Pershing Square, were pretty cushy jobs. Sit on a board of a company, you play golf with the CEO, at nice golf courses. You make a few $100,000 a year to go to 4 meetings. It was kind of a rubber stamp world where boards, at the end of the day, the CEO really ran the show. Once shareholders could actually dislodge board members and they could lose their seats, and that's really the rise of shareholder activism, boards started taking their responsibilities much more seriously because directors are typically, there are many cases they're retired CEOs. This is kind of how they're making a living in the later part of their career. They sit on 4 boards. They collect $1.5 million a year in directors' fees. If they get thrown off the board by the shareholders, that's embarrassing, obviously, and it affects their ability to get on other boards. So, again, incentives, as I said earlier, drive all human behavior. The incentives of directors, they want to preserve their board seats. So if you have a director, now the directors on board serve in various roles. The most vulnerable ones are ones who, for example, chair a compensation committee. And if they put in a bad plan or they overpaid management, they're subject to attack by shareholders. But, these contests are not dissimilar to political contests, where there's mudslinging and the other side puts out false information about you. You have to respond, and they're spending the shareholders' money. So they have sort of unlimited resources, and you're spending your and your investors' money, when you're a small firm, finite resources. So they can outspend you, they can sue you, they can try to, jigger the mechanics in such a way that you're going to lose. There's some unfortunate stuff that's happened in the past, some manipulative stuff.
So also some stuff that's public, like in the press and all this kind of stuff?
Oh, of course. There'll be, articles about, the dirty days where they would go through your trash and, make sure that, you're not sleeping around and, things like this. But that's okay. I'm subject, I can survive extreme scrutiny because I've been through this for a long time.
So you're saying the fat and happy hens can get very wolf-like when the fox is trying to break in? Is this how do we extend this?
Well, the
metaphor?
fox is a threat to the hens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you've just the charismatic fox just explained to me why the fox is good for everybody in the hen house.
At the end of the day, it's actually very good on a board to have someone, there are many examples over time and some handful of high profile ones where the board fought tooth and nail to keep the activists off the board. And then once the activists got on the board, they said, the guy's not so bad after all. The shareholders voted them on. He's got some decent ideas. and let's all work together to have this work out. And so there are very few cases where after the contest, when and by the way, sometimes you have to replace the entire board. We've done that. But in most cases, you get a couple of seats on the board. And it's just, you want to build a board comprised of diverse points of view. And that's how you get to the truth.
What was the most dramatic battle for the board that you have been a part of?
The Canadian Pacific proxy contest. So Canadian Pacific was considered the most iconic company in Canada. It literally built the country because the rail that got built over Canada is what united the various provinces into a country. And then over time, because the railroad business is a pretty good business, they built a ton of hotels, they owned a lot of real estate, and it became this massive conglomerate. But it was horribly mismanaged for decades. By the time we got involved, it was by far the worst run railroad in North America. They had the lowest profit margins. They had the lowest growth rate. Every quarter, management would make excuses, generally about the weather, as to why they underperform versus, and there's a direct competitor, a company called Canadian National, has a rail goes right across the country. And Canadian Pacific would constantly be complaining about the weather. And basically, same country, same regions, tracks weren't that far apart. But it was a really important company, and being on this board was like an honorary thing. And everyone on the board was an icon of Canada. The chairman of the Royal Bank of Canada, the head of the most important privately held grain company, the, sort of an important collection of, big time Canadian executives. Here we were, this is probably about 13 years ago. And, still maybe 44-year-old from New York, not a Canadian, basically saying this is the worst run railroad in North America. And we bought 12% of the railroad at a really low price. And we brought with us to our first meeting the greatest railroader ever, a guy named Hunter Harrison, who had turned around Canadian National. So we'd like, okay, we've got a great asset. We've got the greatest railroad CEO of all time. He's come out of retirement to step in and run the railroad. And we brought him to the first meeting, and they wouldn't even meet with him. And they certainly weren't going to consider hiring him. And that led us to a proxy contest.
And this is where the engine starts churning to figure out how this contest can be won. So what's involved?
The key is we had to, one, come up with a group of directors who would be willing to step into a battle. Mm-hmm. And we didn't want a bunch of New York directors or even American directors. We wanted Canadians. The problem was this was the most iconic company in Canada. And we wanted high-profile people. So we talked to all the high-profile people in Canada. Every one of them would say, Bill, you're entirely right. This thing is the worst road. It needs to be fixed. But, I see John at the club. I see him at the Toronto club. I can't do this, but you're totally right. Mm-hmm. And we had to, and that was the concern, because you have to file your materials by a certain day. You got to put together a slate. We needed a big slate because we knew that we had to replace basically all the directors. And then I spoke to a guy who was one of the wealthiest guys in Canada, who was on the board at one point in time. And he said, Bill, I have an idea for you. There's this woman, Rebecca McDonald. Why don't you give her a call? And I called Rebecca, and she was the first woman to take a company public in Canada as CEO. And she was a kind of anti-establishment, not afraid to take on anything kind of person. And I called her. We had a great conversation. And she was in the Dominican Republic at her house. And I flew down to see her. And she said, yeah, I'm all in. And actually, once we got her, that enabled us to get others. And then we put together our slate. And we had some pretty interesting dialogue with the company. They tried to embarrass us all the time.
In the press, publicly, what are we
talking about? Publicly. At one point I wrote an email saying, look, let's come to peace on this thing. But if we don't, you're really forcing my hand, and we're going to have to rent the largest hall in Toronto and invite all the shareholders, and it's going to be embarrassing for management. And I made reference to some nuclear winter. Let's not have it be a nuclear winter. And they thought they'd embarrass me by releasing the email, but it only inspired us. And we rented the largest hall in Canada, and we put up a presentation walking through, here's Canadian National, here's Canadian Pacific, here's what they said, here's what they did. And then we had Hunter get up. It was this incredibly charismatic guy from Tennessee, an amazing, he's like a lion. incredibly deep voice, unbelievable track record, incredibly respected guy. It's like getting Michael Jordan to come out of retirement and come and run the company. And Hunter was incredible, and Paul Lau, other members of my team were super engaged. And the board, Canadians are known to be nice. So one of the problems we had is shareholders would never tell management or the board that they were losing. It was not until the night before the meeting when the vote came in that management realized that they lost. We got 99% of the vote, and they offered us a deal. When they begged us to take a deal, they said, "Look, we'll resign tonight so that we don't have to come to the meeting tomorrow." That's how embarrassed they were. But that was kind of an interesting one.
So for in both this proxy battle and the company itself, this was one of your more successful investments.
It was. I mean, the stock's up about 10 times, and it's an industrial company. It's a railroad. It's not like a growth, it's not Google. So it's a great story. And the company's now run by a guy named Keith Creel. And Keith, it was Hunter's protege. And in many ways, he's actually better than Hunter. He's doing an incredible job. And the sad part here is we did very well. We tripled our money over several years. And then I went through a very challenging period because of a couple of bad investments. And we had to sell our Canadian Pacific to pay, to raise capital to pay for investors who were leaving. But we had another opportunity to buy it back in the last couple of years. And so we're now again a major owner of the company. But had we held on to original stock, it would have been epic, if you will.
So on this one, you were right.
Yes.
And I read an article about you, and there's many articles about you. I read an article that said Bill is often right, but you approach it with a scorched earth approach that can often do more, can do damage.
I haven't read the often right article, but the good news is we are often right, and I say we because we're a team, a small team, but a fortunately very successful one. So our batting average as investors is extremely high, and the good news is our record's totally public. You can see everything we've ever done, but the press doesn't generally write about the success stories. They write about the failures, and so we've had some epic failures, big losses. The good news is they've been a tiny minority of the cases. Now, no one likes to lose money. It's even worse to lose other people's money. And I've done that occasionally. The good news is if you stuck with us, you've done very well, over a long time.